Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your kind invitation to come and address this very important meeting today. I'd like to congratulate all the organisers on its timing and on its subject, and I will try to say something helpful but perhaps slightly controversial about the current refugee situation that we face. For me, this is a return to Coventry and Coventry Cathedral, which I first visited as a nearby schoolboy, and remember being very struck by the devastation of the old cathedral. And in a way, to me, Coventry and this great, relatively new building symbolise the fact that out of the ashes of enormous disaster can come some good. And it's also a pleasure to follow Joyce Banda in speaking today. I knew Joyce well when I was Development Secretary, and I like to think that Britain helped her in her hour of need following the difficult transfer of power. And indeed, Britain and British development policy have been a very strong supporter of Malawi down the years and recently. As Joyce so rightly said, out of turmoil and dissonance, it is children and women who bear the brunt. And I think it's fair to say the government take very seriously the argument which Joyce put about corruption. Corruption is the cancer of development. It not only discredits the leaders of the countries who are practicing it, but it also does great damage to those of us who want to see the wealthy world giving greater support to the poor world. And I think that what Joyce Banda said about the fact that the houses that are bought with ill-gotten gains are often bought in the developed world is extremely true. And I remember when we were in opposition, seeking to persuade David Cameron of the benefits of organising a march across London which would go with the media from a house to house bought previously by the ill-gotten gains of dictators and others. It was an idea which has not yet seen it come about, but I hope it will in due course as part of the battle in a fairly colourful way against corruption. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we live in a most uncertain world. We've had Brexit. We've had the election of an outsider as President of the United States of America. We have seen Europe turn in on itself, no longer projecting an outward-looking approach to the international community. We have seen Russia challenging the tenets of the post-war settlement. And we've also seen such a conflagration in the Middle East that even the cancer of the problems of Israel-Palestine have had to take a back seat as the catastrophe that is Syria today, with all the refugee issues that have arisen, taking centre stage. And of course, at times of great uncertainty, it is the vulnerable, the poorest, who pay the greatest price, because they are tossed on the waves of that uncertainty. And for many years, the international community, mostly through the United Nations, has tried to wrestle with this uncertainty, the uncertainty that afflicts people displaced by war and turmoil and fighting and conflict, through an international established approach called the responsibility to protect. And the responsibility to protect at the United Nations, R2P, although it has never been properly fleshed out, has nevertheless been seen as an anchor of hope and action for people caught up in this refugee turmoil which I mentioned. And the reality today is that any hope or certainty that the responsibility to protect offered back in the early years of this new century has been dissipated and destroyed by what we have seen happen in Syria. And it was Mike, in his opening remarks for this conference today, who spoke about the ripple effect. And it is the ripple effect of Syria, the greatest catastrophe of modern times, which I submit is causing the greatest refugee crisis which we have ever seen. And the tragedy of all of this is that, coinciding with the events I mentioned at the outset of my remarks, what is happening in America, in Europe, elsewhere in the Middle East, and with Russia, has exacerbated that catastrophe because the international community has not been able to find the voice or the consensus to tackle this. And I want to identify really three aspects of this refugee crisis where the wrong action has been taken and where the international community needs to learn lessons from this tragedy and address these fundamental issues in the future. There are today 11 million people from Syria on the move, people who have been either bombed or brutalized out of their homes and out of their communities. It is a very hard figure to imagine. 11 million people, more than half of Syria. But the sheer number, 11 million people who are on the move, really defies description or even imagination. Within Syria, there are 5 million people who are often out in the open, who are not being properly looked after. The international community has had the opportunity now for many months and years to provide some sort of safe haven, some sort of no-fly zone to protect these people, utterly in accordance with what the United Nations set out to achieve. And the international community, for whatever reason, has been unable to find the collective energy to provide that sort of security. It could have been done up in the north in Idlib and down in Daraa on the Jordanian border, but for whatever reason, nothing was done. There was, of course, the example of John Major's galvanizing of the international community in northern Iraq back in the early 90s to provide safety for the Iraqi Kurds. But none of that feeling or sentiment has been possible on this occasion. And those 5 million people remain out in the open, largely unhoused and fed and looked after in terms of their healthcare intermittently. We have seen hospitals bombed in Syria by Russia and by the Syrian Air Force. These hospital bombings are a breach of international humanitarian law. They are, ladies and gentlemen, a war crime. And we should say that loud and clear because it's true. And by mixing our words and not making clear what is happening here, we do society a great disservice. And it is right that the international community should speak out against these war crimes, being committed by a veto-wielding member of the United Nations Permanent Five. If Russia is allowed to do to international humanitarian law and to the United Nations what Italy and Germany in their turn did to the League of Nations in the 1930s, then all of us are in peril at the degradation and destruction of the fundamental tenets of international humanitarian law. The second concentric ring of refugees is in the neighbouring countries, where Jordan and Lebanon, but also Turkey, have done so much to look after people who have fled across their borders, often under gunfire. Back in 2012, I made my first visit to the Zatari refugee camp on the borders with Jordan and met families and particularly women who had fled over that border under gunfire and who told the most terrible tales of barbarism and brutality in their home communities. Britain, I'm proud to say, was one of the first countries to provide significant amounts of taxpayers' money to look after the refugees in Jordan and in Lebanon to some extent, and also to try and ensure that there were proper provisions made for looking after refugees in a country where in winter the temperature falls below zero at night, and in the summer the dust and the heat are very constraining indeed. But the reality is that Jordan, a country now where 1 in 4 of those living there are Syrians, Jordan, the fourth poorest country in the world in terms of the provision of water, is struggling and the international community have not provided the resources and the support which in many cases they promised to do. In some of these camps, the women and children there are on 50% of the normal prescribed level of daily rations and nutrition. The international community have failed to take advantage of what could be done for these poor people in terms of educating their children. One of the things you can do in a refugee camp, awful and abject though the lives of people there can so often be, is to get together all the children and to educate them. They are, if you like, a captive audience. And alas, we have failed to do even that. So the will of the international community to help the refugees caught up in the surrounding countries has, in my view, been inadequate and needs to be addressed. There is also, of course, the point that is made in Turkey, where the provision for refugees is extremely good. I had the opportunity of visiting some of the camps there with Claire Short, one of my predecessors as British Development Secretary, and seeing for ourselves what can be done to help, but also seeing border towns with Syria, which had previously had a population of 80,000, now with a population of over 200,000, boosted in the last 5 years by refugees coming across the border from Syria into Turkey. The scale of this problem, but also the hospitality and support of these countries with limited means, has to be seen to be believed, and is a boost for one's sense of what can be done with humanitarian goodwill. And finally, we come to those who make the difficult and dangerous journey out of the surrounding countries towards a more prosperous shore in Europe. Many times they put themselves into the hands of the modern-day equivalent of the slave trader in a leaky boat in the hope of tipping up on a safer and more prosperous shore. And yet the European Union has not found the will to properly receive these refugees, look after them where they land, the whole of the European Union and European nations collectively coming together to provide support. And here I make a controversial point. When Claire Short and I were in Turkey and on the Syrian border, we found no Syrian refugees who wanted to emigrate to Europe permanently. We didn't find anyone who wanted to recreate Syria in Europe. We found an abiding desire for the conflict to finish so that they could rebuild their communities and their homes back in their homeland of Syria. And my view is that Britain has done the right thing in supporting the refugees in the surrounding countries upon the principle that you try and keep people as close as possible to the area from which they have been driven, so that they can return. You can hold out the vista of optimism that one day this dreadful, cruel conflict will be over and people will be able to return. And it is in that context that I'm extremely grateful and supportive of the position set out by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, making clear that Britain would lead an initiative to rebuild Syria when the conflict is over, and to try and make sure by putting £1 billion of taxpayers' money on the table at this stage that other countries came together to support what will be the biggest reconstruction we have ever seen in the world when this conflict is over. Rebuilding Syria, accepting that at some point this conflict will come to an end, that the political space will be occupied and that a deal will be done, in my view, is certain. It is the timing in which that can come about which is so very depressing and very deeply worrying. Let me end my remarks by making a general point about British development policy. I am very proud that in recent years a consensus has come in Britain that as a wealthy nation we should commit a specific figure from our gross national income each year to helping the least well-off in the world, to tackling the scourges of deep and abiding, draining poverty and conflict which so disfigure our world today. and to do something about the quite extraordinary imbalance of opportunity which exists in our world too. We need, with that emphasis, that collective will which now covers all the main political parties in Britain, to drive forward development policies which tackle the great scourges of our age, whether it is climate change, migration, or terrorism. These are tackled by trying to build safer and stronger societies overseas so that people don't need to migrate away from conflict and poverty. And that is the aim of British development policy. It is to focus on tackling conflict, stopping it starting, once it's started, stopping it, and then reconciling communities which have been riven apart, and building prosperity through not least a more open and freer trading system. After all, it is by economic activity, by ensuring that you are able to take part in activity which enables you to feed and educate and look after your family, that progress is so often being made. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you don't find my comments too depressing, but I seek to make the point that the international community has failed the enormous number of refugees who are on the move, mostly at the moment, though by no means exclusively, from Syria and the region, and that there must be a better way of looking after the people who are caught up in this sort of turmoil in the future, and a more effective way for the international community to come together and put flesh on the bones of the high-sounding principles that were enunciated so clearly in the United Nations in New York on the responsibility to protect, and see that it means something to people today caught up in great danger and jeopardy on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to kick us off on our panel discussion, I'm going to turn to my speaker on my right. To introduce him is Mr. Imran Madden, who is Director of Islamic Relief UK and previously headed the humanitarian department at Islamic Relief Worldwide. And Islamic Relief, of course, has been at the forefront of some of these efforts to support refugees, both in the UK as well as in the region, close to where conflict happens, as well as advocating for the rights of refugees. So Mr. Madden is going to talk for 10 minutes, give us a little bit of an overview of what your organisation is currently doing, and we've asked all of our speakers to give 3 key points about what you think the British government or others should be doing to tackle this global crisis. Mr. Madden.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and good morning to you all. And thank you very much for inviting me today and giving me the opportunity to address some of these really important issues, specifically around refugees in Europe. If you don't know Islamic Relief, if I can sort of summarise what we do most of and we're best at, it's delivering much-needed aid to very vulnerable people in very difficult parts of the world. We didn't really plan it that way. It's just that the world being the world as it is, we've ended up in a number of conflict zones, delivering to people who are often just out of reach or just within reach. So that's what we've done for the last 32 years. So you would think that the current crisis would be one that we would be prepared for, and I'd have to say that on so many levels we are absolutely committed to responding to refugees in the Middle East and beyond. But we have to say that on pretty much every single level we're stretched to our absolute limits. So in terms of 2 or 3 things that I'd like to talk about and focus on, I think I can now talk about the conflict through humanitarian eyes. I'd have to emphasise that the best, the most conducive operating environment for a humanitarian aid agency is peacetime. And we welcome any ceasefire in a conflict, and we particularly welcome an end to conflict. In peacetime, we have access to communities that need our help. We're able to plan, we're able to work out the logistics. We're able to maintain our impartiality when we're dealing with different sides within a conflict. So we always reflect on that. In other words, when we have a protracted crisis, like, for example, in Syria, in the Middle East, beyond 5 years, we have to say that we have to almost reinvent ourselves and invent new ways of responding to these disasters. So we would underline, and it's very much the theme of our discussions today, that we want to see the government, committed again to diplomatic efforts to secure peace in the region. We tend to stop here as humanitarians because people then ask us, we should start negotiating with X or Y or Z. I can then back off very conveniently saying, I'm a humanitarian, not a politician. But we are very concerned about the way that the whole conflict is unraveling, and Andrew Mitchell has reflected on some of the appalling crimes that have been committed against humanity within Syria. So we'd have to say that peace would give us a fantastic opportunity to reach every single person in Syria that's within our mandate, within our sort of with our budgets and our infrastructure. The second point, I think, is to emphasize that, again, it's a point that's been mentioned once or twice today already, that 90% of refugees are still within the region. I think there's a very valid conversation around Calais and around the million-plus refugees that have made it to Europe so far, and those issues, which I'll touch upon in a moment, about the UK and its capacity to take refugees. But what we've been trying to do as an agency is to underline that 90% of those refugees are still within the region. Recently, we produced a publication called Invisible Lives. I have a few copies if you want to grab one later on. And it really emphasizes that the lives, in particular, of Syrian women in the region, in places like Iraq and Lebanon, is largely overlooked. And we know that there are major issues with funding of programs within the region. I think Andrew Mitchell mentioned that something like 50% of there's been a commitment of only 50% of funds required. But if you look at things like livelihoods, that's down to 6%. So only 6% of what's required to fund livelihood programs in the region are actually being funded. So we see an opportunity here. We have Syria as a middle-income country, a refugee population in places like Iraq and Lebanon, generally very well educated. Amongst the women refugees in particular, you have many doctors and teachers and nurses who are there, able to work amongst their refugee populations, but are not able to do so for a number of reasons. One is the funding, and I've underlined that is a major issue. But we've also discovered that there have been major issues about restricted access, restricted movement of women. Some of the refugee camps are not secure, or need to be more secure in terms of protection. But it's also about attitudes of maybe the male folk within the families not wanting to see women travel to certain parts of the camp or even outside the camp. So we're underlining that there is a massive opportunity here to support refugee women in refugee camps in places like Iraq and Lebanon, and to help them access jobs and help them start businesses. But if you can reflect on another particular area, which is education, around 50% of refugee children in Lebanon and Iraq are not currently going to school. There's a fantastic opportunity there, of course, if we can get greater access for women refugees into schools. We're not only addressing a livelihoods issue, we're addressing an issue of education. I mean, the mind boggles when you think of a whole community where within that community 50% of refugee children are not attending school. And the research has shown quite clearly that the despair of young people with no education or job prospects can fuel radicalization. So I think this is, again, we're talking about a time lag of a whole generation being brought up without an education, being very vulnerable to radicalization. So that's another time bomb that we are very conscious of. And we've emphasized that, again, gender-based violence, a topic that we've already heard about today, is a real issue. And, we're concerned about the levels of gender-based violence being experienced by women in particular in those camps. So I think my second point is to refocus our attention on the region and to ensure that we are committing our funding, but also highlighting, as we've done in our report, those invisible lives. And thirdly, if I can go back to the issue of refugees in Europe, we have recognized it is an unprecedented crisis. And I think as such it requires an appropriate response, and we feel that that hasn't been the case. I mean, over 1 million refugees have reached Europe. The government, we've recognised, has had a major commitment and has played a major role in funding programmes in the Middle East, and that's been a very clear strategy, and I think it's a very welcome one, and it has had a major effect. But we've appeared at party conferences, so this is probably not new to you, Andrew. You may have heard us say this on a number of occasions, that we do feel that the 20,000 commitment of 20,000 over 5 years is not adequate. And unfortunately, I know there's very complex discussions within government. There are complex discussions within government, but beyond government, when it gets to the media, it tends to be reduced to a calculator exercise, and we feel that there is so much more to this than just the numbers. We have a legal, humanitarian, but above all, moral commitment to these people within Europe. There are 100,000 unaccompanied children that have gone missing, and there are still 95,000 that need our help. If we just reflect on those figures, it's hard to think about our response being adequate. So we're trying to nudge it beyond the calculator exercise discussion and say, reflect a little bit more on our moral responsibility and say, look, it's okay to think differently because this is an unprecedented crisis, and it is acceptable for us to break some molds and introduce more of a discussion around that commitment to those refugees. And I think, again, we would look to government to steer some of the language away from the rhetoric that we've seen in papers that is, xenophobic and Islamophobic and everything else, and largely inaccurate. That, government, I think, still has a place to counteract some of those voices with a more rational discussion. So, yes, hard to be positive on occasions. If we see this as a test for early 21st century humankind, I think we are failing on many, many levels. And we need to reflect as individuals, as citizens of the UK, of Europe, and as global citizens, some of us here from around the world today. So if this refugee crisis is not a wake-up call, what is? I mean, we really do need to have a completely rethink on our response to the whole crisis. But, as a humanitarian, I can't really I can't fulfill my mandate unless there is a political solution, of course, to the crisis. So we would encourage government to make a greater commitment to those refugees coming to our country. We think it needs to be a lot more than 20,000. We would like to extend its influence within Europe and encourage those countries within Europe who have closed their borders, I mean, illegally, on many levels, breaking international humanitarian law. Encourage them to open their borders and have a coordinated effort within Europe, but also to show leadership by accepting more than the 20,000 in the next 5 years. I think that's it from me.
Imran, thank you very much for those comments. Really useful and insightful. And I'd like to turn now to my colleague, Sabir, and I'll introduce Sabir. A wake-up call. Sabir, according to Imran, and needed, Sabir Zazai is a very esteemed colleague here in Coventry. He is director of Coventry Refugee and Migrant Centre, and he's a very, very active member of the city's diaspora Afghan community. Sabir is also a practice fellow with us at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. And this year he was appointed to the Cathedral Council in honour of his contribution to peace and reconciliation in the city. Sabir, your comments, please, in 10 minutes.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here in this magnificent cathedral to talk about refugees and the plight of people who are forced to flee their homes because of conflict. I came to Coventry about 17 years ago, and I was given a warm welcome by the community and the people of Coventry, but they didn't tell me that one day I'll be sitting here and addressing people in the cathedral, so it's amazing. The work of Coventry Refugee and Migrant Centre, again, it reflects the warm welcome that Coventry has extended over the years to people from many different backgrounds and countries. We are a centre that was set up by 3 kind-hearted volunteers, initially operating from a laundrette, helping newly arrived refugees from conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places as people were being dispersed because of the government policy then to Coventry. And we now continue our services. We are a team of about 39 paid staff members and about 80 volunteers, helping refugees with a range of services, from therapy to housing to employment support, English language lessons, and also integration and acculturation. I think when I reflect on our work, I think about this appetite and desire that the British public have shown over the last 12 months at least, or since last September, when the tragic images of Aylan Kurdi appeared on our screens, and everyone wanted to do something. Everyone wanted the government to do something. I think it just reflects that warm and also the compassion of the community, where hundreds of thousands of people came out and said, refugees are welcome here and the government should do something, which followed the government commitment of 20,000 Syrian refugees. So it is very, very timely to talk about refugees at this stage. And what I would like to say is that what we have observed in the political debate and in the discussions about refugees is, I personally, as a former refugee, I feel that no one across the political spectrum has done any favour to the debate. Refugees are used in the war of emotion from the left to right, and in between we've got the academics who are working hard to bring some facts to the table, but we're still ignoring those, and we're still forgetting the fact that we're talking about real human beings, people with hopes and aspirations, people who are forced to leave their homes, people who are fearful and need our protection. But almost we get to this level that even myself as a former refugee can get into this kind of like a bubble where I think that there are only numbers that we're talking about. And when we talk about it as a refugee crisis, and when we say the Europe's refugee crisis, I think here is more or less a crisis of compassion and humanity, and it's a crisis of our kind of like response, what we can do. It's not a crisis of refugees, because if you look at the 65 million people forced to flee their homes, Europe only received over 1 million people last year, and Britain got 37,000 or 38,000 asylum applications out of that. So in a sense, here we're not looking at it. The crisis is actually, it is a refugee crisis, but here it's a crisis of compassion, and we're kind of like struggling. We're not getting to grips with what we should do and how we should do that to protect refugees. We've got 79% of these people arriving in Europe, according to UN Refugee Agency, were from the top 10 refugee-producing countries. And I think let's not forget that this is not only the Syrian crisis. We've got long-standing crises in places like Afghanistan. We've got still going the situation in Iraq and Eritrea. I mean, where on earth a lady from Eritrea with a child would go? If you look at her options in Europe or Britain, I think the answer is that her options are very, very limited. The need to prove your need for protection is becoming much more challenging. People who served our armed forces in Afghanistan, Afghan interpreters, 20,000 Afghan interpreters worked with the armed forces, and we only accepted 600 or 700 people to come to Europe or Britain. And I think it just shows that those are people that really need our protection, but we're looking only at smaller numbers still. And I think it's comparatively becoming much more difficult for people to get to Britain. When I was forced to leave Afghanistan, as Honourable Andrew Mitchell said, and Imran as well, not everyone wants to leave their country. When the war started in Afghanistan, we were internally displaced for many, many years in another city in Afghanistan. We didn't want to go to Britain. We didn't want to go to Europe. We wanted a peaceful return to our home in Kabul. And we waited years, days, months, and weeks, and that was not happening. And even today, it's not happening. I was born in war. I was brought up as a refugee, and today I'm here. So some of the conflicts can be very, very complex, and there's no solutions to them. So if I go back to what could be done in a way, I'd say that there are three key things that we could do. One is to avoid the deaths of people crossing borders. 3,770 people died in 2015, and may they all rest in peace. These were people, these were human beings with relatives, people like me and you, but the only difference was that they had lost everything, and they lost their lives as well. Because we are focusing more on externalization of our borders rather than giving people safe passages. So the one thing that could be done is looking into safe passages, especially now when the world is in the grip of the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. Another one is to look at refugees as assets, enabling refugees to make a contribution, especially those ones that are here, not making life difficult for them by microaggression of services, and also the fact that they can make a viable contribution. Yesterday I was in Cardiff at the Amnesty International dinner, and I met 3 Syrian lawyers in one dinner. These are people who can make a contribution, but what we need to do is invest in them. I came to this city, the people invested in me, the community invested in me. I'm not unique. And every refugee, if we invest in their integration, can make a special contribution, and they've got something special to offer, but we need to invest in them. So that is very, very important to make that, to enable refugees to make their contributions. The third thing that I'd like to say that could be done is that we need to think about not just protecting refugees, but we move further from that and think about restoring their dignity. Because when you run away from war, when you run away from a conflict, it's your dignity that is affected. And if you remember Alan Kurdi's image, he was a child without dignity on a beach. And we have to do something to ensure that these people feel that they are able to rebuild their lives in safety and dignity, and that we protect their rights and we give them the resources to rebuild their lives and also make a viable contribution. So I think we need to celebrate the strong public mood that is there, the volunteering, and the fact that people are making journeys to Calais and other places to help refugees. But at the same time, look at this, that war, moving people from war, we need to move them into prosperity and not poverty. And I think when refugees prosper, we all prosper. And I'll end it with that. Thank you.
Sabir, thank you very, very much for those comments. And so Melanie, real human beings, not numbers. And I'd like to turn to our final speaker on the panel before giving the last 1 or 2 minutes to Mr. Andrew Mitchell before we close. Melanie is the Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy for the International Rescue Committee, which I think is one of the biggest organisations in the world which works on supporting refugees globally. So that would be very interesting to hear about that. But in addition, Melanie is an anti-poverty campaigner and a political activist and a trade unionist as well. And she's previously served as a human rights observer in Palestine and Israel and was head of advocacy at ActionAid. So a long history in this field. Melanie, over to you.
So as Katharine said, I'm from the International Rescue Committee. For those of you who don't know us, we were set up in 1933 at the request of Albert Einstein at a time then when many refugees were fleeing from Europe. And the role that we played was helping them to find safe new homes in the US. And today we work in around 40 countries on humanitarian response, helping people to survive immediate crises, to recover and to regain control of their lives. And one of the interesting things about us in the context of this conversation is that we work across the arc of the refugee crisis. So we work inside Syria, we work in the countries receiving most refugees around Syria, in Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon and Turkey. We also now are working in Greece and in Serbia, and also on integration and support in Germany. And we resettle 10,000 refugees every year into the US. So we are working right across from the immediate crisis itself to helping people to find a new life. I wanted to start off just by recognising Andrew Mitchell's work and his role as a hugely important advocate for aid and development in our country. The work that he does really matters, particularly on Syria in Parliament, and has been very important in recent years. And I suspect that as we go forward in the next few years, it will continue to be even more important. I wanted to talk about 3 things today. We were all asked to give 3 things. Mine are about what the British government could do here at home, in the countries that refugees first flee to from Syria, and at a global level to help resolve conflict. So starting off here at home, just building on what you've heard Imran and Sabir say, I think we have to start from the premise that mobility is the new normal. As Katharine said at the start, we're living in a global displacement crisis, and on average, people are away from their homes for 17 years. Now, just to give a comparison of who's putting in what amount of effort in responding to the refugee crisis, per 1,000 people in the population, Lebanon hosts 183 refugees. Jordan hosts 87.45 refugees per 1,000 people, and South Sudan hosts 26 people per 1,000. The UK hosts 1.9 refugees per 1,000 people in the population. And when we look at what we are asking other countries to do in terms of hosting fair shares of refugees and dealing with the crisis and putting in levels of effort, we have to start from the effort that we ourselves are putting in. And as you heard Imran say, 20,000 refugees or 4,000 per year, we can definitely do better than that. The EU is currently negotiating a new refugee resettlement framework. That's something that the UK won't be involved in. But it doesn't mean we can't do more. IRC would say that a fair number of refugees for the UK to be resettling would be in the region of 16,000 per year, which is only 24 per constituency. And don't tell me that we can't do that. Linked to that, you have to ask, what are we doing to help resolve the crisis on our doorstep in Europe? It is a crisis that's been created by politics. And I'd ask you to think for a minute about the situation in Greece today. 60,000 people remain stranded in Greece, most of them in substandard accommodation. It's coming into winter and we've got old people and children living in tents on European soil. That's completely unacceptable and completely resolvable. And the UK could help to resolve that by expediting family reunion claims so that children who are stuck in Greece and others are able to join their families here in the UK. The second thing I wanted to look at was the role that the UK plays in the countries of first destination for refugees fleeing Syria and elsewhere. And Andrew talked about the role that the British government has played in providing aid in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey and so on. And I don't think that that's controversial. I think that's really important. And I think that, certainly would never argue against improving people's lives when they have had to flee their home in Syria and they're stuck living in a camp somewhere. It really, really matters. What I'd say is that it's not a choice between doing that or hosting our fair share of people here at home. And I pay tribute to the work that the British government did in February this year, hosting the Supporting Syria and the Region conference. That focused on trying to get 1 million new jobs created for refugees and host communities in the region, in creating new education places, and in vastly increasing the sums of aid available. And that really matters. What I would say is that progress is too slow. Too many countries aren't coughing up the pledges they made on aid. The recent progress report on the education of children in the Syria region showed that actually there are fewer kids in education than there were beforehand. And on the jobs front, something which massively matters, both in an integration sense, but also if you're living in Azraq camp or in the Bekaa Valley or somewhere like that, being able to try and make a living for your family in that situation matters massively. But if you're a refugee in that situation, I doubt that you've seen very much change. So we really need the British government to turbocharge that and try to improve things. And that brings me to my third point, which is the UK's role on the world stage in terms of trying to resolve the root causes of the refugee movements, which of course is about conflict. And Andrew spoke about the Syria side of things already. The Prime Minister made a speech about the UK's role on the world stage last night in the context of Brexit. And I'd say that it would be great to hear a bit more about what we seek to do on the conflict resolution side of things. Because even without the EU, the UK still does have a lot of tools available to us to make a difference on the world stage. We're in the UN Security Council, the G8, the G20, our economic power, our exports, NATO and the Commonwealth. And of course the huge power of our development and humanitarian aid at 0.7%. But I would say that when it comes to conflicts and crises in Yemen, that the UK government should be behaving differently. In Syria, there's so much more we could do, particularly to put economic pressure on some of the key actors there. And on Iraq and the current crisis that's being exacerbated as they seek to drive IS out of Mosul, on the demining front, for example, there's lots more that the UK could do to make a difference there. And then finally, on the refugee crisis front, the UN held a refugee and migrant summit in September. Whether or not it changed anything is a debatable point. I think most of us would probably say it hasn't. Over the next 2 years, though, there is a chance where the UK is going to be, where the world is going to be negotiating a new framework on refugee responsibility and also on migrants. And if the UK chose to do so, it could make a significant contribution to that effort, and it could be pushing and driving others to also do more and to play their fair parts in helping to deal with the crisis. So there are all kinds of opportunities in front of us as a country. It's all about political will and how we choose to take advantage of those opportunities. But there's certainly much more we can be doing here at home, in the first destinations that refugees flee to, and on the world stage as well.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for those comments. And I'd like to turn again to Mr. Andrew Mitchell for the last couple of minutes to give your thoughts in response to what you've heard from our three speakers there. What kind of role do you think, based on what they've said, UK can play on the world stage?
Well, it is an evolving role for some of the reasons which I made in my opening remarks. And I thought there was a lot of agreement, really, between your panellists today. I've been arguing about these issues with Melanie for the last 11 years, and I think we seem to be getting closer to agreement on many of them. And of course, it's the role of civil society to push politicians to do more and to be more effective in tackling these problems. I have to say, as a politician, that I think that the handling of the debate on immigration in Britain has been absolutely appalling, and we as politicians have to take a lot of responsibility for that. And certainly the profoundly inadequate debate about the benefits and challenges of migration in the referendum underline that point. But you know, when I saw the picture of the little boy who died on the European shore, I felt physically sick for a number of reasons, apart from the obvious one, which was that picture could have been replicated several times a day, every day, for the previous 2 years. And British newspapers which take part in this debate, one of them I remember had referred to migrants and refugees as cockroaches. And after that picture appeared, wrote an editorial saying that Britain should let more of them in. Now, when you have a debate that is so ludicrously constructed as that, where the media can take those two completely opposing views in the same paper within about a week of each other, you can see what a challenged and difficult debate this is. You know, I think that Britain should take specific categories of refugees, certainly children. I was very much in favour of the Save the Children initiative to take 3,000 unaccompanied children from Greece and look after them, and also to take particular cases where our health service can provide support and cure, which is not available elsewhere. But in the end, you know, the refugees are the symptoms, and I end on this point, are the symptoms, not the cause of this crisis. The cause of this crisis, overwhelmingly, and of course, you're absolutely right that there are intractable problems in Eritrea and Iraq and Afghanistan. But the cause of this crisis overwhelmingly is the tumult which has afflicted Syria. And I spoke today as a humanitarian, really, but as a politician, I just want to end on this point, that I don't have the answer to Syria. But I know that these conflicts end in one of two ways. Either there is a military victory, or there is a negotiated solution. Well, there's not going to be a military victory in Syria. Anyone with the faintest understanding of what is happening on the ground there can confirm that that is the case. So there will eventually be a negotiation. And the reason why I and others have spoken out so strongly about the bombing in Aleppo is because at the end of the day, we have got to try and ensure that there is the space created by a ceasefire and an ending of the fighting so that the politicians and the negotiators can engage. It won't be easy, it will be very messy, it will take a long time, but at the end of the day, this conflict will end because a settlement is negotiated between the warring parties. And there's a great deal more that the great powers can do to affect that. It is the one silver lining, in many ways, on what has happened recently in the States, that a relationship between Trump and Putin could bring the speed of that negotiation forward. That the regional powers can do more to bring about this space for negotiation. And finally, in my reading of history, which isn't terribly good, but I say this given the academic firepower that is deployed here, it seems to me that it is possible that the Treaty of Westphalia, ending the 30-year war in Europe of 1648, I think, may have lessons for us today. The profound religious conflict and barbarity that afflicted Europe for so many years. There may be lessons from the Treaty of Westphalia when the international community, the great powers and the regional powers, got together for a settlement that was legally based, where disputes were settled by law and not by fighting, and where there were guarantees by the great powers, the powers that could effect, guaranteed the treaty that was negotiated. There may well be lessons from deep history to assist us as we try to grapple with the effects, but also bring to an end this appalling catastrophe that has engulfed the Middle East.